Is that he got us out of Vietnam, which was something that his predecessors hadn't been able to do, and he got us out without setting off something akin to a civil war here in the United States. That is to say, Nixon had a lot of pressures on him. The anti-war movement may have been capturing the television camera's attention, but there were an awful lot of people in this country who wanted victory in Vietnam. I think the worst thing you can say against Richard Nixon is that almost half of the names on the Vietnam Wall are the names of young men who died when he was the commander-in-chief after he decided this war is unwinnable. It was the longest and costliest retreat in our history.
Watergate is defined, I noticed, in the dictionaries now as abuse of high office occurring during the presidency of Richard Nixon.
Watergate may be in the dictionary today, but the story was still a minor one when Richard Nixon's second term began in 1973. Stunning successes in China and the Soviet Union and the impending end of Vietnam had given Richard Nixon a landslide victory and pointed to a glorious second term.
As we meet here today, we stand on the threshold of a new era of peace in the world.
But even in his triumphant moment, Richard Nixon's presidency had been fatally compromised. And within 18 months, revelations of extensive illegal activities, including obstruction of justice, perjury, and the payment of hush money, would bring down a president for the first time in history.
I condemn any attempts to cover up in this case, no matter who is involved.
There was a cover-up from day one. Now, what I don't think anyone really ever did and sat around and planned was how to obstruct justice. That never happened. What happened is everybody just sort of slid into this terrible quagmire because of the problems that Liddy and his men had created.
Just before the inauguration, the Watergate burglars had appeared in federal court before a man who had proved to be one of the president's most dogged opponents, Judge John Sirica. 2 weeks after the inauguration, the Watergate story began to gain momentum.
The Senate tonight voted 77-0 to establish a select committee to investigate alleged political espionage in last year's election campaign. That includes the Watergate bugging case. The committee will be headed by North Carolina Democrat Sam Ervin.
On March 21st, 1973, John Dean warned the president the cover-up was getting out of hand. It would take a lot of money to keep the Watergate burglars quiet.
I tried to convince the president, as the tapes show. I told him at one point, you know, there's a cancer growing on the presidency. And if I assumed that he would take the scalpel out quickly and cut it off. And he didn't. To the contrary.
People say, geez, if he'd have just come out and said, I'm going to punish the guys who did it and we're going to clean up the operation around here. If he'd have done that, the press and Judge Sirica would have wanted to know, what else have you guys been up to? And what else have they been up to? They'd broken into Dr. Fielding's office out in California to try to get some goods on Daniel Ellsberg. What else had they been up to? They had been bugging foreign embassies. What else had they been up to? They had been bugging American newspaper reporters. What else had they been up to? They'd been running these dirty trick operations. In other words, to admit that those were my guys and they did it and I'm the responsible party, opened Nixon to all of the crimes that had been taking place in his first administration.
The president now believes, through a subsequent investigation, that his previous Watergate investigation, conducted by John Dean, was full of holes.
John Dean began to feel he was being set up to take the fall. His lawyers began meeting with federal prosecutors to secure the best deal if and when he went public with what he knew. Jeb Stuart Magruder, the deputy head of President Nixon's 1972 re-election committee, also met with prosecutors and told them about the meeting the previous June when the Watergate break-in was planned.
Sources say that Magruder has told federal investigators that he attended a meeting in the office of then Attorney General John Mitchell in February of last year, where he says the Watergate break-in was plotted by Mitchell, G. Gordon Liddy, and John Dean III, personal counselor to President Nixon.
Every day, the trail drew nearer to the White House.
The plan kept evolving as the problems evolved. There was no one person who was going to take the rap. There were several people. You know, initially it was thought, well, you know, we'll stop it at Liddy, then we'll stop it at Magruder, then we'll stop it at Mitchell. Then as it started coming over to the White House, then we'll stop it at Dean. And then the president decided, I'll stop it at Haldeman and Ehrlichman.
It finally got to the point where Bill Rogers and Kissinger and one or two others advised Nixon strongly that we were liabilities. We were getting beat up in the press every day. These accusations were hanging over our heads. And so he decided to fire us.
The president was becoming ever more isolated as his closest aides moved from the White House to the committee rooms and the courtrooms.
John W. Dean III went before the Senate Watergate Committee today and, as expected, gave the committee names, dates, and places involved in the Watergate affair and its cover-up. Included among those names of the names of those having knowledge of the cover-up was Dean's former boss, the President of the United States.
The story had the town by the throat. When it got to the urban hearings, you could leave your office and take a cab to the Senate or the House, and you wouldn't miss a word. I mean, it was on radios all down the corridor or television as you left your own building. It was on radio in the cabs, and it was on the open doors of the Senate office buildings, and on the desks of the guards. It was everywhere.
July 16th, the unbelievable revelation at the Senate hearings. Everything the president and anyone else had said in the Oval Office had been taped secretly by the president himself. There was now a new issue at the center of the Watergate story. Would the president release the tapes? He refused, claiming executive privilege.
This is a rather remarkable letter about the tapes. If you notice, the president says he's heard the tapes, or some of them, and they sustain his position. But he says he's not going to let anybody else hear them for fear they might draw a different conclusion.
This principle of confidentiality of presidential conversations is at stake in the question of these tapes. I must and I shall oppose any efforts to destroy this principle, which is so vital to the conduct of this great office.
Archibald Cox, the Watergate special prosecutor, had refused to accept merely a synopsis of the tapes. On Saturday, October 20th, the president ordered his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox. Richardson refused and resigned.
President Nixon had to reach down to the number 3 man in the Justice Department, the Solicitor General, Robert Bork, before finding someone willing to obey his order to fire Archibald Cox.
In the wake of what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, the president's impeachment was no longer unimaginable. Stunned by the fury of the public's response, the White House agreed on October 30th to turn over the subpoenaed tapes to Judge John Sirica, but 2 of them were missing. On November 21st, another startling revelation.
On the day the prosecution suspects the Watergate cover-up began, the crucial conversations between the president and his chief aides are missing or partially obliterated.
Those tapes which do remain were finally put in the custody of the court this afternoon, a month after the White House first agreed to honor the subpoena.
For the president, the news just kept getting worse.
By an overwhelming vote of 410 to 4, the House of Representatives today gave its Judiciary Committee unqualified powers for an investigation to determine if there are sufficient grounds to impeach President Nixon.
On April 30th, 1974, the president made public transcripts of some of the tapes, which he had edited heavily. They were an instant bestseller, and to many readers, they showed a man capable of more mean-spiritedness, pettiness, and even bigotry than they assumed could ever inhabit the keeper of the Oval Office. And the passages he'd excised, and his frequent use of the words expletive deleted, only fired any reader's imagination, not to his advantage.
I think the tapes give you instead of a truthful impression of Nixon, a warped one. Because he was not the same person to Chuck Colson as he was to Arthur Burns. He wasn't the same to Pat Buchanan as he was to me. Now, perhaps this is a fault. At the same time, it's a complexity.
As spring turned to summer and the legal wrangling continued, 2 trips now brought back images of the foreign policy president, even if they didn't succeed in pushing Watergate off the front page.